Topic: Southern paternalism, a parallel between the antebellum South and the textile industry in the Chattahoochee Valley. Mr. Gilbert, please.
Good morning. As Dr. Ellisworth said, my name is Dwayne Gilbert, and the title of the paper is Southern Paternalism, a Parallel Between Antebellum South and the Textile Industry in the Chattahoochee Valley. Now, when I first began doing my research project, an archivist asked me what my paper was about. And I told him I was doing a paper on paternalism and the Southern textile industry. But he was quickly to inform me that the textile industry was progressivism and not paternalism. It was then I realized the term paternalism strikes a negative undertone to people associated with textile mill life, because the term closely relates to the antebellum South and its association with slavery. However, there seems to be some sort of relationship between the antebellum South and the textile industry in the South. As industry moved southward, elites in the South reshaped paternalism from a way to manage slave labor to a way to manage cheap white labor in an industrial system. I argue that the Southern textile industry did not replicate the Southern antebellum slavery system, but instead the Southern textile mill system parallels with the slave system. For evidence, I looked to find parallels through interviews of mill workers from the oral history collections at CSU. I looked through some of the family records at the Callaways and the LaGrange archives. I also looked at some newspaper clippings. To begin, we must look at the paternal structure of the slave system during the antebellum period. Generally speaking, the plantation owner stood at the top and viewed himself as a father figure to his slaves. Some slave owners even used paternalism as a justification for slavery. Stephen Yaffa states in his book, Big Cotton: How a Humber Fiber Created Fortunes, Wrecked Civilizations, and Put America on the Map. He states this: the South's elite and omnipotent planter class had created an airtight argument for slavery upon which rested the smooth efficiency for the ruling system. Ideally, in exchange for their forced labor, the slave owner provided their basic needs such as food and shelter. Now, after the destruction of the South in the Civil War, the white elites shifted from running plantations to running industry. Mill owners had the capital, but the problem is they needed the workforce. Therefore, they looked to poor whites in the South, failing agricultural economy. Now, the textile industry attracted poor whites for at least two reasons. First, the poor whites looked for a way out of poverty. In an interview from the mill owner, from the mill worker oral history collection, Miss Josephine Atkins from Eufaula, Alabama, actually described her farming life before she entered into the mills. And she said that the farming was an extremely difficult cycle. Their family focused on growing cotton and peanuts and depended on selling their goods in order to get ready for the next season. She further stated how her family had very little extra money, and farmers had a season in which they could not grow crops. It devastated their families. In essence, textile mill work gave whites a sense of stability. The other thing is, secondly, is racism. Also attracted poor whites to the mills. The Southern Union and the free blacks faced one common problem that linked them together: both poverty and poor quality of life. Mill life offered whites an opportunity to gain advantage over the poor black freedmen. In essence, mill owners utilized this concept to their advantage by attracting poor whites into mills and leaving the blacks on the farms. Thus, mill owners recreated a hierarchical system in which a separation of class existed that was based upon race. And Charles Gulick wrote in his 1930 article, where he saw this, he said both groups saw an opportunity for retaining white economic supremacy by maintaining cotton manufacturers as a white man's industry. Through this type of patron-client relationship, a different form of paternalism created in the Southern mills. Now, mill paternalism differed and it looks similar to plantation paternalism. A key difference between the two is agency of workers. The textile industry attracted workers with the appearance of opportunity to move up. Granted, mill owners did not own its workers, but the labor force appeared to have the ability to gain some sense of agency. If a worker sees the opportunity to learn a skill or trade, they potentially could move to a mill or go back to farming. For example, Columbus Henry G. Wright, a white male, began working at the Swift Mill in Columbus in 1936 as a floor sweeper, but he retired as a supervisor. Wright's story seems ideal, but in reality, the hierarchical system based on race and on gender still remained in place. because Wright was both white and male. Now, female worker Celia Bailey started in 1936, and she was working for the old Columbus Mill in 1936. Her first job began with filling batteries, and she eventually worked her way into a weaver, but she admitted men and women typically did not change jobs. Her employers placed her in a supervisor position, but they never gave her the title. Some of the men she worked with went to Georgia Tech or Auburn, and the mill provided them with financial assistance if they pursued some sort of textile degree. However, she would not be able to receive any sort of assistance to go to college. So Bailey and Wright, they both started near the bottom of the mill, but Wright continued to move up, while Bailey never officially gained recognition. Now, Jerry Thrasher, a black Navy veteran, he discussed some of the same things that he discovered at the beginning of his career at the mills. And according to Thrasher, the mill management gave blacks the lowest and dirty jobs at the mills, such as digging up ditches and cleaning up floors. And Thrasher began as a fire boiler. 3 months later, he became a mill correspondent and he ran errands for management. He never moved into a supervisor role, but Thrasher's mother also took care of his boss, Ari Ward. His mother was served as a black woman relegated to taking care of white children, of both white mill workers and bosses. In comparison to slavery, one of the duties of the slaves was to look after white children, in some cases. In short, the 19th century and early 20th century witnessed an influx of industry and pushed for a more progressive South. However, there stood an attachment to the antebellum South underneath the progressive shroud. But race and gender is only one parallel to the antebellum South. Many slave owners feared uprisings by their slaves to compensate their fear that they might give slaves incentives to keep them happy, or they might even punish them. Perhaps a slave might be able to learn to steal or even given weapons to hunt with in some cases. In the textile industry, wages served as a primary incentive for mill owners to draw workers in, but owners may provide other incentives. The Callaway Mills established some of the best incentives. Fuller Earl Callaway, the founder of the Callaway Mills, not only developed mill villages, but schools, parks, churches, and even a stadium to hold its annual field days for the workers. This stadium held an annual field day started in 1934. But these incentives would not be enough to prevent the influence of unions, nor the general strike in 1934. And the President Casey Callaway saw another strike in 1935. Southern mill paternalism saw unions as rivals and bitter enemies, moving to shut them out. In the North, unionism started to rise as early as 1880. And as unions tried to unite on the national stage, they reached opposition in the southern states, and their promotional efforts halted. Mill owners knew that workers were indispensable and counteracted the strikes by explaining to the workers that if they did go on strike, they would lose their job and would be replaced by someone else. For example, Iris Waller, her husband, worked for the Callaway Mill. She discussed her experience during the 1934 strike. She crossed the picket line because she was concerned about providing for her family. Her boss, Lloyd Thomas, convinced her and her co-workers to cross over. According to the interview, many people refused to go back and lost their jobs. Paternalism became a roadblock for unions because of its psychological influence on mill workers. According to a 1935 Atlanta Constitution article on the Callaway Mills, were fully employed again, and with 1,100 applicants waiting for a job opening. The strike simply proved that workers were still at the owner's disposal. Then there's a culture and language of mill workers as it was attached to respect or love of antebellum paternalism. As stated before, the owner, generally speaking, and the workers saw their owner as a type of father figure. For example, Melvin Wilkes referred to Eagle and Phoenix mill owner Frank Bradley as the big daddy over there. Some interviewees saw supervisors and overseers synonymously. And we know the term overseer was used to describe the middleman between the slave owner and the slaves. And mill workers developed a common ground and were able to build a family-like atmosphere, much like the slave communities meshed together during the antebellum period. Psychologically speaking, the influence of paternalism never went away. Many mill workers describe workers and mill workers interviews describe their career in mills as a great experience to work and how they love their bosses. For example, Wright spoke about the Swift Mill as the best place he had ever worked. A familiar pattern I saw in many of the oral histories was from the collections at CSU was how the atmosphere had changed once it changed hands. Generally speaking, their loss of love for their mills, as I said, began to start out as the mills changed hands. According to many of the interviews, mill owners eventually sold their businesses, and the family atmosphere sort of disappeared. New owners no longer kept a close relationship with their employees, and in fact, employees barely even saw them. In conclusion, paternalism has been part of the South since its development from the colonial period. If one looks at evidence, it demonstrates many similarities between the Old South and Southern textile industry. Both are embedded in racial and gender discrimination and exploitation of labor. Slavery is seen as a dark period of American history, rightfully so. And even though there is this comparison, the textile industry with the paternalist elements is still seen as the golden age of the textile industry.
God, Dwayne.
Thank you, Dwayne. Very enjoyable. I neglected to mention at the outset, though, that as you see listed in your program, we had a course title. It's called Another Land, Capitalism, Race, and Chattahoochee Valley Mill World. And Another Land comes from